So welcome everybody. Welcome to the Results-Based Protection webinar on designing for contribution and exploration of integrated protection programming. Before we get started, I just wanted to have Eileen McCarthy, our program coordinator, talk you through the logistics so you understand how the webinar will go and where you can type in questions, etc. So I'll turn it over to Eileen.
Yeah, welcome to the webinar. So all the attendees are muted because there's a lot of you here. But if you have questions throughout the discussion, feel free to add them into the chat box or question and answer box, and I will bring them to the panelists. Also, if you have any technical issues or questions otherwise, feel free to add those in, and I can try and troubleshoot from here.
Great. So thanks, Eileen. So let me just introduce myself. My name is Jessica Lenz, and I'm the Senior Program Manager for Protection here at Interaction, and I lead on the work on results-based protection. And I'll introduce our panelists in just a minute, but I just wanted to let everybody know that this webinar builds off of the discussions coming out of the Results-Based Protection Roundtable that we held here in Washington in November that brought together around 40 different practitioners to explore how the key elements for results-based protection are used and applied in practice. And to find out more details about those key elements, you can visit our website, which we'll also have posted here at the end of this webinar so that you can see them in more detail. In addition, the webinar really picks up on current discussions and recent reports that have come out that have identified a need for a whole-of-system approach to addressing the most pressing protection concerns, as well as the ISC statement on the centrality of protection, including developing HCT protection strategies, and even the World Humanitarian Summit, the report from the Secretary General that speaks about collective outcomes. And what we're really trying to understand and have a better sense of is how do we do this together? What does contribution look like in terms of multiple actors at multiple levels and multidisciplinary actions? How do they come together to address a protection concern and reduce risk? And so to further elaborate on those that core topic that we're exploring today, we have three speakers today who will be speaking both from a practical sense in terms of what's happening in the field, as well as the work around results-based protection and understanding how this looks like in theory and hopefully ultimately in practice. So we have Patrick Sooma, who is the Humanitarian Protection Specialist from World Vision, who will be speaking, as well as Jenny McAvoy, our Director of Protection here at Interaction, and Michela Macchiavello, who's a specialist from the Vulnerable Migrants Unit at IOM. We had also Echo and Sophie Lancombe, but unfortunately she had to cancel at the very last minute, and so we won't have a donor's perspective unfortunately today. But we still have a very good panel, and hopefully that will still be quite interesting and an interesting discussion. Before we get started and engaging with our speakers, I did want to mention that we're looking at this topic today, contribution and integrated protection, and we're narrowing it down to focus in on one protection issue. So certainly we could talk about this more generally and look at all protection issues, but we decided to look at trafficking, human trafficking. So that discussion primarily will look at examples from across the globe, and then particularly building on what's coming out of the crisis in the Middle East in terms of human trafficking and what we need to do collectively, and what does contribution look like in order to address that particular problem and reduce risk. So to get us started, just to make sure that we have a better understanding of what contribution looks like and really to illustrate the complexity that comes with multiple actors at multiple levels engaging in trying to reduce risk, we thought we would begin with sharing a diagram with you to kind of illustrate what we're talking about, and hopefully this sets the stage for the discussion today and allowing our participants or allowing our panelists to be able to speak to this. So, sorry about that. So I have a little Prezi diagram here just to kind of set the stage. So if we are looking at designing for contribution and addressing human trafficking, this would be kind of the issue. So what we'd like to kind of, be able to do is kind of set the stage in terms of what that looks like at the different levels and who are the different actors who may be engaged and engaged in different initiatives to address the threat of trafficking, the vulnerability of different individuals who may be exposed to this, as well as the capacity of individuals to prevent or their own coping mechanisms to prevent or stop this type of abuse. So obviously we would be looking at the individual level. So just say, for example, you have a young single male Syrian refugee who's at risk of trafficking for forced labor or recruitment into armed groups. You would want to make sure that you're looking at the family level, the community level, the national level, regional level, as well as the international level. So you'd end up seeing multiple levels where different actors would be engaging on this particular issue, protection issue, and trying to address that risk. They may be addressing that risk and working at the vulnerability and trying to reduce vulnerability. They may be looking at capacity and trying to empower individuals or different pieces of the community or various actors to support their coping mechanisms, or you may have actors who are directly looking at the threat and trying to address the threat head on. And so just wanted to kind of explore what this might look like in this environment. So if you start off with, for example, humanitarians may actually be working and setting up referral pathways, perhaps established by the livelihoods or GBV or even health sector working groups to support trafficking survivors and individuals at risk. This may be actually looking at reducing vulnerability. You may also have, still within the humanitarian community, perhaps the community group for single unemployed men being established, perhaps by UNHCR. This could be through a partnership with a local NGO, and it could be providing space for dialogue and employment resources, for example. You could also see from the humanitarian community perhaps agencies who are setting up livelihoods programs that are directly addressing vulnerability and capacity that may be at risk. At the same time, you might have other actors that are not within the humanitarian community, but perhaps working on the legal frameworks and policies. So this could be, looking at, for example, the Palermo protocols. So something at the international level, but obviously have implications for how national policies are made and how they trickle down. You might also have, perhaps from the development actors, those actually looking at training, for example, on human trafficking for law enforcement. So this could be a development actor that is currently working on this. You might also have human rights actors, in addition, working on monitoring and tracking exploitation and trafficking. In addition, you could have civil society beginning awareness-raising campaigns around risks of human trafficking, again, focused on vulnerability and the capacity. And again, you're seeing this at different levels playing out. You could even have various actors, for example, Interpol, who tracks and arrests the traffickers. You could have the state itself. Perhaps they've recently reformed their refugee law around employment rights. Again, so another actor working on trafficking. And again, you could also have families themselves or even the individuals themselves who are also initiating, for example, shared income generating activities that might be a coping mechanism or a way to prevent young single men from having to seek out work or who might be exposed to trafficking. So what this is showing you is in our environment there are multiple actors at multiple levels engaged in multiple disciplinary efforts to reduce risk. Some of these actors are focused specifically on addressing vulnerability, some are addressing capacity, and some may be addressing the threat. And by laying it out, you kind of have an understanding a bit more. I mean, obviously, in real time, you would do a much more thorough analysis, and there could be multiple actors that we haven't even mentioned here. But the issue is there are quite a number here working on the same issue. But how do we all come together and build off of each other's initiatives to recognize or to understand and measure whether or not risk has actually occurred? And so our discussion then looks at this. What are the relationships, for example, between those actors who are working on legal frameworks with those that are actually then developing livelihoods programs, or those that, you know, what's that relationship with families who initiate shared income generating activities, and then what's the relationship there between the international legal frameworks again. And you can see these, and I'm sorry, with using a Prezi, we don't have the advantage of showing the different types of relationships and how they go back and forth. But the arrows certainly you should see them on both angles, perhaps dotted lines, perhaps different types of relationships. Oh, sorry, I wanted to go back. So, but what I wanted to illustrate to everybody is just the complexity that you see amongst these different actors, their relationships, and how we're monitoring and measuring over time the contributions that each of us is making in order to be able to ultimately reduce the risk. So we leave you then or begin our discussion with a question that hopefully sets the stage, and our participants or our panelists will help to answer. But how do we better understand, incorporate, and purposefully design for these relationships and their contributions to better achieve and measure reduction in risk? Okay, so now we're going to move back. That's just to set the stage so we have a good idea of what we're talking about, and hopefully everyone's on the same page. So we're going to bring in Patrick Sooma, our first speaker. And I'm wondering, Patrick, Patrick was recently responding in the Philippines during the Haiyan response, and actually World Vision began a program that was an integrated approach to look at human trafficking, particularly engaged with the livelihoods sector. And so we'd like for him to actually share his experience with that type of a program, and why they took an integrated approach to address trafficking. So Patrick, are you there?
Hi Jessica, yes, I am there, and I'm on my phone, so my network is not that great, so should it drop, I will keep trying to come back on and off. Please pardon my network.
Okay, well, we're glad that you're able to still join by phone. So please, Patrick, if you could elaborate a little bit further on the work that you were doing in the Philippines, and why you decided to take an integrated approach to addressing trafficking.
Sure. So at the wake of Haiyan, we did get reports from engaging with the community, but as well as reports from OCHA, from MIRA. And in those reports, they highlighted the risk of trafficking because of, you know, the Haiyan having destabilized coping mechanism, but also most importantly, within the community who highly depended on coconut as a source of livelihood, without any alternative because of the destruction of coconut, it was highly likely that they would resort in dangerous coping mechanisms, among which included moving away from where they're currently located in search of employment in metropolitan areas of Cebu as well as of Manila. And some of them even had the thinking of, sending their children to work in homes or in pubs. So as a result of that, we conducted a detailed assessment and developed a program that focused on eliminating the risks associated with the economic situation, and our focus was on eliminating the possibility of human trafficking. We adopted a two-pronged approach, which was more preventive. The first one being providing the community with sustainable livelihood options, and the second approach was information provision to the communities, as well as capacity building of formal and informal protection mechanisms that existed at the municipal level, but as well as the village level, the barangays. So in looking at the analysis, we realized it's required several actors to be involved in order to have a very effective and robust response. So internally, we had to look at what are the key sectors whose intervention will have an impact on curtailing trafficking of persons. So what we thought was livelihood is one of the sectors that if we coordinated closely with, would provide livelihood options, alternative livelihood options to farmers who are dependent on coconuts. Related to that would have also been providing information to the communities about the risks of trafficking, the dangers of trafficking, and profiles of traffickers. At the municipal level, we were looking at working with the local government, the Department for Social Welfare and Development, I think DFWD, which basically had the mandate of handling cases of trafficking in persons. They had a database, but as you know, after the earthquake, after the typhoon, challenges were about capacity and resources. So it was important for us to work with them on building their capacity as well as provision of resources where we could. But beyond the local government, we also had to coordinate very closely with agencies who had a presence in areas of OMOC. And notably amongst them was IOM, which had a history of working on trafficking of persons. And they had developed training and outreach and awareness materials which they could share with us. We also coordinated very closely with Plan International just to make sure, we broadened our coverage, but also did not overlap in terms of areas of coverage. There were also local organizations which focused a lot on trafficking, on curtailing trafficking in persons. So we coordinated with them. But on the livelihood aspect, we had to look at institutions that were providing technical skills training. So we had to partner with them and do that. So in short, really, our approach was heavily informed by, a second wave of analysis or assessment, if you like, which really helped us identify who were the people at risk and who we would engage with to ensure that we reached the people who needed it the most, but also tapped into the community self-coping mechanism and built on that where we found that to exist. And such partnerships really increased and broadened our reach, but also ensured that we were very effective. And cases in areas where we did not have expertise or resources, then they would cover. So in short, that was briefly about the project that we looked at. We were operating in 10 barangays or villages in mostly the areas of Ormoc. Over to you, Jessica.
Great. So you somewhat touched on this already, but I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit further on how you engaged other actors. You mentioned multiple different actors that you did bring in, certainly through analysis, and then looking at their contribution. But how were you engaging other actors in your design, for example, of your program and other sectors? Specifically, obviously, you were looking at livelihoods. So what did that look like, that type of an engagement? I wonder if you could talk a little bit more in more depth about that.
I think right from the time of the assessment, we had to understand who were the key. We had to map out and determine who were the key stakeholders in this field and understand what kind of expertise existed. So when we mapped out that, then we had to engage with them in consultation about, kind of picking their brains and getting their thoughts. What was the situation before, and what is it, how best can we address that? And then recognizing what their role is and what is our role. So a lot really, initially, a lot of effort was put in coordination and basically consultation right from the beginning. And then when we had kind of consulted and had a sense of who is going to do what where, then we agreed on a plan of action, looking at what's our strength and what is their strength, and how can we tap into those resources and pull them together towards addressing. So the time for the implementation, if we had planned, for example, for information provision, then we would seek the expertise of IOM to come over and actually do information awareness within the community. If we had to go to the school, then World Vision would take the lead on that. So it was really more about consultation right at the beginning and coordination, and then towards the implementation, it's about how do we utilize the resources that are available. So, I mean, in short, yeah, we had to talk to them right from the time of the assessment and determine who was there, and then engage them in discussion.
Great. I'm wondering if you could perhaps talk to us about the practical challenges then and the barriers to addressing the protection issue through this integrated approach. So perhaps if you could elaborate on those, the challenges.
For me, the greatest challenge was try and get every one of us on the same page. So we are all singing from the same hymn book and kind of seeing the end result through the same lens. And trying to understand that, if we have to do an integrated approach, then we kind of have to have a very shared vision, but also the approach that we are going to adopt should be something that is understandable by each of the different sectors. So it needed them to understand what is the protection aspect of this. And it also required that my protection team really understands what is the role of livelihood in this whole process. So it's just beyond, the theory of understanding what livelihood is, but the practicality of going to the field. How does it exactly look like? And how does it complement each other? So that understanding was quite crucial. And initially, before the teams had that understanding, that was a bit of a challenge, because then, livelihood being a sector as it was, has its completely different approach. And so does protection. But how do you harmonize the approach to achieve that? I think the other thing was also because of the destruction and the level, we did not have so much resources like we had assumed. For example, the local government, the Department of Social Welfare and Development, they had staff constraints because staff was poor. So it was a bit of a difficult in terms of coordinating, but also being able to tap into the resources that they already had. Documentations were destroyed. Staff was spread way too thin. So oftentimes, we had to work double time the resource. And yeah, I mean, different actors have different priorities, and oftentimes it's competing priorities. They also do have response to do. So trying to pull them together and have that discussion and move forward was a bit of a problem initially. But once understood where it was and where we were going, then it became difficult. really my lesson from the challenge I learned is, can we get everybody to sing from the same hymn book?
Great. Thanks so much, Patrick. I'm going to probably return to you a little bit later, but I'm going to move on right now and bring in my colleague, Jenny McAvoy from Interaction, to help us look a little bit more at what's required then if we were to use this approach using a results-based protection perspective to design for contribution beyond, for example, 2 sectors and building on the contributions of multiple actors from multiple sectors and disciplines at multiple levels. So Jenny, I'm wondering if you could elaborate on what a results-based approach to protection might look like when addressing human trafficking.
So thanks, Jessica, and hello, everyone. I think my starting point would be the same as Patrick's, with an emphasis on a starting point of analysis. And one thing I would really underscore is the importance of working from the perspective of the affected population. You can look at, secondary data, you can look at sort of, broad trends in terms of, what are the patterns of trafficking, across a given region. But if we're to have any kind of focus and really understand what is the problem that needs to be solved, it really needs to use the perspective of the affected population as the starting point. And that means really coming to grips with their own assessment of their threat environment in order to understand their vulnerability or their exposure to certain threats. So, having lost, a source of livelihood in a major disaster or armed conflict situation, what then are the consequences for their exposure and vulnerability to threats? And indeed, what capacities do they have to counter that threat or to evade or cope with that threat in some way? And this analysis, starting from the perspective of affected people, if you really tease out all of the factors that are contributing to whatever level of risk people are experiencing, then that lends itself almost immediately to identification of very specific problems, which in turn lends itself to pinpointing certain sectors or certain tools that can be deployed to help solve the problem. So if you really disaggregate, what are the reasons for the levels of violence being experienced, the coercion, the deprivation, and then how all of that, feeds into the broad risk pattern associated with trafficking, for example, then it allows you to zero in on the dynamics related to livelihoods and economic policies and other aspects which affect coping capacity and ability to subsist in a disaster or conflict context. So I really think that's the key. Now, of course, this analysis will be greatly assisted if you, from the very beginning, take a multidisciplinary, multi-sectoral approach. It just opens the lens and the range of options, that can be brought to bear, during an analysis process. I think the challenge with that is that it can be, when you're in an emergency situation, very difficult, obviously, to assemble all of the various kinds of expertise and personnel that would be needed in order to take a genuinely multidisciplinary and multi-sectoral approach from the very beginning. Particularly if, going back to the diagram that Jessica showed earlier, particularly if these disciplines and sectors are in fact operating at different levels. So for example, an issue like human trafficking obviously is a transnational, international issue quite often. So how do you assemble, the relevant expertise in real time? And I think that the important thing here is to remember that analysis is not a one-off process. It's in fact continuous. And once you come to grips with the idea that protection outcomes can be best achieved in a multidisciplinary, multi-sectoral way, and once you come to grips with the idea that analysis is an ongoing process, not a one-off process, then we can all take a deep breath and realize, okay, this is something that we're actually building over time. Let's take an initial step, do some initial analysis, initiate some initial activities, while using that as a springboard to reach out to other actors and say, hey, you know, we're trying to solve this bigger problem. We need your perspective. We need your expertise. We need your role. So the second piece, you know, once you've got sort of that kind of process and momentum underway, I think the key thing is to be able to piece together what does the logic of your intervention actually look like. And the diagram that Jessica showed us earlier, I think is a good example of, you know, walking into a situation where you're not starting from absolutely zero, but you're trying to make sense of what is already happening in a given environment, you know, addressing a certain risk pattern. And if you can identify, okay, so who's doing what to address the threat itself, who's doing what to address specific vulnerabilities vis-a-vis that threat, and who's doing what on the capacity front, then you can start to piece together, okay, so this is how this will have the effect, the desired effect on this, have the desired effect on another sequence of actions, and so on. And be able to identify the gaps and then, you know, mobilize other actors as needed in order to start to play a role. So in this respect, I think this gets to the point about how do you design an intervention which, you know, from the very beginning, you're already anticipating incorporating the contributions of multiple actors, is by piecing together this, using the analysis as a basis to piece together this, this causal logic.
Great. I mean, to build on that a little bit, and this also came out through the roundtable, and we can see it through the diagram. I mean, there are so many ideas and approaches and capacity. It can probably create a lot of ambiguity and a disconnect at times.
Yeah.
So how can we build a common understanding and find mutual respect in order to achieve effective collaboration? And perhaps can you elaborate on how a results-based approach can overcome some of these barriers, and what set of professional skills perhaps or resources or tools might we need?
So I think this is the real challenge, and it's a challenge we face within the humanitarian community, and it's a challenge we face in terms of how the humanitarian community relates, or in fact lacks relationships with other actors. You know, if we're coming to terms with the idea that to achieve a comprehensive and meaningful protection outcome, we need multiple disciplines and we need multiple sectors working together, and yet, you know, in reality, because we have tended to work in a rather siloed way, sectorally, and distinguishing humanitarian action or perhaps not building relationships between humanitarian actors and others, you know, we're not going to have the habits that we need in order to undertake joint problem solving. So I think as we, you know, try to develop our own skill sets and our own methods and approaches for collective outcomes going forward, we really need to anticipate the reality that we're going in the next couple of years, we're going to be bringing together multiple disciplines and multiple sectors operating with their own conceptual frameworks. They have their own ways of working, their own, you know, traditions, you know, within their own disciplines and sectors. And indeed, you know, we may be operating within different systems. So, you know, the humanitarian system in its behavior, can be very different from the systems within which development actors operate. And yet we're probably going to need that complementarity and those alliances in order to really, practically solve problems like human trafficking. So I think number one, sort of anticipating that we do need to invest time in developing those relationships, invest time in understanding one another and how different sectors think and act and how they behave and perform. And really invest in our own skill set to be able to coordinate, not just amongst ourselves, but involving others. One of the things that the discussions around results-based protection often brings me back to is thinking about, okay, so what does my dream team look like for a really effective approach to achieving protection outcomes. And one thing I always come back to is, in reality, we don't need a huge army of protection officers running around. What we need are really effective and efficient multidisciplinary teams. I would almost rather trade 5 or 10 protection officers for a really solid food security expert, livelihoods expert, economic policy expert, information campaigns leader, really strong, community organizers, a handful of specialists in say, national policy and child protection, and so on. So I think we need to think in terms of mobilizing the skill sets that are necessary to solve the problems that we're encountering.
No, that's great. And I think a question that would come up then is, if we're able to do that, if we have a multidisciplinary and multi-level response, how do we monitor it to understand whether or not the actions of all these different actors actually support the achievement of a protection outcome?
Yeah, I think this requires a bit of a cultural shift. I think we certainly have the tendency within the humanitarian community, but particularly within the protection community, to be a lot more output oriented rather than outcome oriented. And an output orientation may end up monitoring things like how many police did you train, or how many workshops were held, or how many community groups have been organized, rather than orienting ourselves towards the outcome. Now, with an issue like human trafficking, I think outcome level monitoring will be incredibly difficult, and I think I'll be interested to hear IOM's perspective on this, because it's extremely difficult to establish the numbers affected. And of course, extremely difficult to monitor people not trafficked. So then in that instance, it means we need to go back to the analysis. What are the risk factors? What are the threats? How are those manifested? What are the vulnerabilities vis-a-vis the threats? What are the capacities vis-a-vis the threats? So ultimately what we end up monitoring are whether those risk factors are going up or down, and allow that to sort of lead us to an understanding of whether the outcome is being achieved. I think the other thing that is important to track in our monitoring systems are the assumptions that are embedded in our causal logic. So our causal logic, will have set out, X will lead to Y, will lead to Z, and so on. But embedded within that are certain assumptions about a sequence of events or a chain reaction that we're trying to set off in order to practically reduce the risk that people are experiencing. But we need to track those assumptions in order to know whether or not they need to be modified or or validated in some way, and in order to be able to adapt our response. To say, look, you know what, X is not leading to Y, we need to adjust our course of action and recalibrate in order to achieve the desired outcome. Thirdly, I think we need to be mindful that we work, you know, this involves working in extremely complex situations. So we need that constant adaptation, including to account for any new risk factors that are emerging, which speaks to the need for broader situational monitoring as well. The last thing I'll emphasize on this is, you know, what all of this means, I think, is that our information management systems need to be really purposefully designed in order to enable us to do that continuous analysis and in order to enable us to make decisions in real time. So monitoring should not be treated as a rigid segment of a project cycle, but rather just, you know, a continuation of this ongoing process of analysis and adaptation.
Great. I have one more question before we move on to get perhaps even practical examples from IOM. But I wanted to know if you could elaborate a little bit further on a comment I heard recently, which was we've become too tied to our own or who owns what outcome. So for an individual caught in the chaos or turmoil of conflict, what matters most is that risk is comprehensively reduced in prevention and response. But simultaneously, we're hearing a lot about formal mandates becoming too constraining to take a whole of system or a collective approach to achieve a protection outcome. So in some ways, this seems a bit contradictory. Can you respond to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the danger in, you know, some of the language that we're increasingly using around collective outcomes and shared outcomes is that ultimately no one owns the outcome. You know, we can very easily pass the buck to one another or say, that's not my responsibility, that's somebody else, you know, that has responsibility for that. And I mean, that's just a complete nightmare. That's the worst symptom of poor coordination that we see in a number of situations today. I guess I would rather see a strong emphasis on, in fact, a very robust sense of responsibility for outcomes. I guess I want people to own the outcomes, to take responsibility for them, to lead the charge on, you know, the sequence of events that can help to reduce risk and have meaningful impact. But I think, you know, that means building ownership, you know, from the very start, building in a sense of responsibility and obligation from the very start. And, you know, that goes back to the idea of, you know, assembling this multidisciplinary team, you know, that can undertake a multidisciplinary analysis. And I think, you know, we can observe, you know, it's a question that, you know, barely you know, needs to be answered so explicitly, but of course mandates can be a constraint, but it's all in the interpretation. You know, mandates certainly, formal mandates certainly involve a focus on certain population groups or certain issues only. And this can lend itself to rather formulaic and predetermined activities, or, you know, a certain package of services that are always rolled out, or a modus operandi that is always used in relation to certain issues or certain population groups. But, you know, once, you know, if we can embrace this idea of collective outcomes and multidisciplinary approaches, then I think we can lose some of the rigidity of mandates and, in fact, think much more in terms of how my role relates to somebody else's role, and how to manage a process collectively which works towards the desired outcome. And I think that, part of the idea behind a results-based approach to protection is that it's not formulaic. Rather, it sets out methods that allows choices to be made, that allows people to come together and problem solve rather than superimpose a certain template in a context where it may not be appropriate. So I think there's plenty of room there for shared ownership. It's all in sort of the attitude and the approach in terms of, how we take our next steps to embrace collective outcomes.
Great. Thank you so much, Jenny, for participating. Now I'd like to move on to Michela from IOM and to see if we could get some more perhaps recent examples from the Middle East and Asia. So Jenny just spoke to us about how using a results-based approach to protection can support an integrated approach to protection, but what does that actually look like in practice? So Michela, do you think you could share with us the IOM's findings on the protection gaps identified in crisis settings, give us some examples of your response in the field to address these gaps, and how your efforts to engage multiple actors across multiple disciplines to respond to this risk of increased vulnerability to exploitation and trafficking during a crisis?
Sure. Thank you very much for inviting me and for sharing so far from Patrick and Jennifer. Very, very interesting contributions. I hope to remember the questions, and especially from Jennifer to address it while I speak. If I forget it, please remind me. Just to go quickly through to let you know that the kind of work that we've been doing on addressing human trafficking and exploitation in times of crisis, we have carried out a research quite comprehensive that was looking at basically the past 11 years of current and past crisis. And we have considered a number of countries within it. I will go on them in a moment. But basically, just to cut a long story short, and to allow participants also to actually participate, the main findings of the research actually indicated that in crisis situations, existing vulnerabilities to and manifestations of trafficking in persons can get exacerbated, and that new crisis-induced trafficking and exploitation types arise. Now, the main conclusion is that actually counter-trafficking efforts are indeed a matter of life and livelihoods for the victims, for the affected individuals, and should be given as much priority as any other crisis response from the onset. To be more specific, we have concluded that the response to address trafficking and to prevent it cannot afford to actually wait for evidence, because evidence actually already exists. However, it might not necessarily be evident, be easy to show. But the fact that it is not easy to show, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Indeed, the various case studies that we have considered show that this is indeed the case. Evidence exists, although it might not show immediately. This, however, should not prevent us from acting. The sooner we act, the better to prevent extreme vulnerabilities to become exploitation and to actually prevent cases of trafficking and abuse. Now, the research also lists a number of recommendations for all the actors involved. And this is indeed to address some of what Patrick was saying before, that indeed all the actors have a responsibility to ensure that they do play a part here. So we have included in the research specific recommendations that address really all the actors that are liable, important to provide a response. So we address the humanitarian community, we address the donor community, we address local governments, local law enforcement, NGOs, international organizations, civil society organizations, because indeed each one of them should consider that they hold the responsibility to interact with one another. But this is also the gaps that Jennifer was pointing out just now before me are indeed very real. I will touch upon them in a minute. Let me just tell you that the list of countries that we have included in the research are the following. We have looked at Libya and specifically the crisis from 2011-2014, Iraq most recently starting from 2014, Syria and the Syrian refugee crisis starting from 2012, more recently Yemen, and that pertains to a situation of armed conflict. Then we've also looked at natural disasters, and so indeed we've started with the countries affected by the South Asian tsunami, Thailand, Sri Lanka and Indonesia in 2004, Haiti in 2010, the Philippines affected by Super Typhoon Haiyan in 2013, and I was very pleased that Patrick could provide further details about the action of World Vision, and more recently also at the response to the earthquake in Nepal in 2015. We've also looked at situation of protracted crisis or so-called complex migratory crisis, and we have included the Eastern Africa and migratory route through North Africa. Now, to give you an example of what we've actually found in this, and it might actually be important because I don't think that, unfortunately, it is still to be taken for granted that trafficking is accepted as one of the direct consequences of crisis, despite the fact that, indeed, luckily, a large number of research are now coming together to show that this is not the case. This is, in fact, the opposite. In most of the countries affected by armed conflict, we found that indeed the absence of rule of law has and the fact that the infrastructure had basically collapsed and still is led to examples of forced labor, sexual exploitation, specifically in Libya, extortion and racketeering, arbitrary killing. This is very similar in Iraq, where we have found evidence of very serious crimes against humanity, enslavement of ethnic minorities, mainly for sexual exploitation, of which, unfortunately, we know all of us about, recruitment of children by rebel armed forces for various purposes, and indeed suspicion of organ removal to supply organs to the rebel groups. Indeed, in all these countries we have found evidence of crisis-affected population resorting to negative coping mechanisms, amongst which, of course, the practice of resorting to early and forced marriages or temporary marriages, so that's so-called muta, which indeed has been exacerbated, for example, in Syria, and a number of cases of labor exploitation, family separations, unsafe migration that indeed can lead to exploitation. For what pertains to the examples of natural disasters, we have indeed seen the mass displacement, formal and informal camp setting, the breakdown of law and order, and the disruption of livelihood indeed can heighten the risk of human trafficking, and traffickers gain a much easier access to possible populations to exploit. We've seen it throughout. We've seen it by considering the countries affected by the Asian tsunami. We've seen it in the Philippines, indeed. We've seen it in Haiti, and most recently also in Nepal. But let me just go into maybe what we consider the key findings of this research that really addresses and is more pertinent to the discussion that we've had so far. The research identifies a number of gaps that have been found to be still an obstacle to providing an integrated and effective response to protection. The first gap that we have found is the fact that trafficking per se does not as yet have a formal space within the humanitarian response to a crisis. Let me just explain. The protection cluster and its two AORs, the GBV and the child protection AOR, are already doing a very, very good job at addressing some cases of trafficking, but unfortunately quite a large number of them are still remaining out. So this is one of the first issues. And then we have a number of what we call response gaps, response from a number of points of view. And this also, the first one that I'm going to talk about, also addresses what Jennifer was mentioning just a minute ago. That is the missing link between the humanitarian community and the development community. Now, this is something that we've seen and we continue to see. We believe that it is particularly vital that these two communities speak to each other in a consistent manner, especially when responding to situations of trafficking in emergency. And the reasons are simple. The humanitarian community is a specialist of providing response in crisis, which the developmental community is not necessarily. However, the developmental community is indeed aware of the challenges that trafficking was posing before the crisis, and so the response, their knowledge needs to inform the response by the humanitarian community. In fact, even better so if the response is a joint one. We also have another gap that well, I call it also, yes, response gap, and specifically relates to the understanding of this issue by the donors. Traditional non-crisis donors should start to consider funding and supporting initiatives of trafficking in crisis, because indeed this is something that in a way responds to their mandate. It is still trafficking, although it is presented in a crisis setting, and vice versa. Traditional emergency donors should consider the issue of trafficking as being an intrinsic part of the response to emergency. I can elaborate more on this later on through questions, but another last point that I wanted to make is indeed, again, in connection to what was said before, a number of response gaps as well from the side of the humanitarian community. The humanitarian community tends to respond with a number of items that indeed are typical of the crisis, and these are often the so-called non-food items, the NFIs, that are supposed to be temporary, but then in the end very often end up being a bit more than used in the short term. And indeed, one of the issues that affects directly the vulnerability of crisis-affected populations is the lack of livelihoods. So one of the things should be brought to the forefront in the response is indeed the inclusion of livelihoods from the very start. So the fact of not just giving the egg, but actually giving the chicken to the affected population. Now, since you actually mentioned Asia, yes, indeed, in the response that we have given most recently to address trafficking and exploitation in times of crisis, during the recent crisis in Nepal in 2015, we have managed to basically convince the donors to allow us to be present, to respond to the challenge of trafficking from the very beginning. And this has had very tangible results. This has allowed to indeed carry out a vulnerability assessment. So this connects to what Patrick and Jennifer were saying. Indeed, the crucial importance of running a survey of what the situation is at that moment, to know exactly who is there, who is doing what, and what is missing, how to address the gaps. It has also basically allowed us to set up a counter-trafficking and exploitation in crisis team that would work hand in hand with our colleagues working in the emergency and operations department, and to engage each single department working within emergency to also keep an eye onto protection and counter-trafficking issues. And so basically this has involved a number of international and local donors, on which I can provide more information later, to provide a more comprehensive and effective multi-sectorial and approach and response to the challenge.
Great. Thank you so much, Michela. There's some really good examples there, particularly the last one in what IOM is doing internally as well and with donors. And I'm wondering if you could build on that even to talk a little bit about then how IOM engages other stakeholders in a humanitarian response to ensure their contributions are addressing the protection or counter-trafficking issue that's understood, and how do you build upon that?
Yes, indeed. Now, I must admit that as a number of other agencies, we suffer from this division internally, even between, the responders to emergency situations and responders to situations of need in ordinary times. And I don't know if you or the actual participants are aware of this report that was published by Danida quite recently in November 2015 that is called Coherence in Conflict, Bringing Humanitarian and Development Aid Streams Together. Very, very interesting reading. It specifically refers to the division that, if you like, exists in the majority of organizations that are providing a response to emergency situations and developmental issues, where indeed the gap is not as yet, it remains a gap. So one of the first things to do is to indeed realize that a gap exists and to address it. And this is what we are currently doing now. The team that works to provide a response to programs in ordinary times is working hand in hand with the team that provides a response to times of crisis. And the actions that are undertaken in crisis are tied in with a response, with a more classical response to migration, but adapted to the emergency setting, which is not an easy thing to do, but absolutely necessary, because this brings us to addressing the gap that still exists indeed between the humanitarian community and the developmental community. And when I refer to when I say the developmental community, I talk about not only the international organizations, UN agencies that were present and that remain present before the crisis and during the crisis, but of course also the large number of very capable actors, starting from the local government and ending with a number of local organizations, NGOs, and organizations of the civil societies that need to be allowed to be considered to have a voice in responding to the crisis. Now, this is something that worked, I think, quite well in Nepal. The challenges remain in the sense that, as I was mentioning before, it is not to be taken for granted as yet, and in fact far from to be taken for granted that trafficking and exploitation are as yet understood as being directly related to the crisis. And this is true not only for the international community, the humanitarian community, but also for local actors and the donor community. So this is something that we might have to face for a number of months still before, you know, it can actually sink in, be digested at the international and local level. And this is something that indeed we found in Nepal. But one thing that worked very well, first of all, internally for us, was to to ensure that our colleagues in emergency also were very well aware of the kind of action that we were addressing and the reason why we were addressing it. And so this maybe takes me to what Jennifer was saying, you know, the dream team. Indeed, the dream team doesn't necessarily need to be, is not to be composed only by protection officers, but by specialists to the emergency response that keep an eye open to issues of protection and counter-trafficking and counter-exploitation. So that they indeed keep on doing their good work, but by keeping an eye and referring to the correct team when there is a concern. So first of all, we have addressed this gap internally, and this has brought quite remarkable results. We had referrals that would come in, first of all, within our organizations of potential situations of exploitation or actual situations of exploitation. And this would allow our team on the ground to immediately respond. But this has also allowed us to then be aware of situations of vulnerability among the crisis-affected population and to share it more widely within the present humanitarian community as well as with the developmental community. So we've worked in Nepal very closely with the agencies that were leading the protection cluster and specifically the 2 AORs, and little by little things have started to work so that the response has become a joint one. So, for example, the fact of drafting advocacy messages to alert the population about the potential risks of trafficking. I think that Patrick has highlighted and stressed very clearly during his presentation, has been done with the buy-in and the complete support of not only the local institution that would help the international community understand the local context and phrase the messages in a way that was correct for the local context, but also especially supported by the local government to really, I mean, the fact of having the local government support has been very important to actually be accepted, to have the initiative accepted as viable and making sense and reflecting the fact that it was in fact comprehensive, reflecting the voice of the international and local actors involved.
Excellent, great. I think you partially answered some of what I was going to ask next, so I'm wondering if maybe you could speak to a little bit more on that engagement with various stakeholders, but perhaps elaborate more on what that looks like at the different stages of the program cycle, you know, as you're starting to do an analysis or, like as Jenny mentioned, the development of a causal logic or even the program design. What does that kind of contribution look like? And perhaps here also go ahead and build on some of the challenges and roadblocks that you have seen as you are doing that, maybe that you're seeing now or that existed in the past when trying to bring together multiple actors or engage different actors from different sectors to respond and to engage on trafficking.
Yeah, there would be a lot to say. I don't know whether I managed to actually fit in everything that I want to say. Now, let me start with the challenges. Challenges remain there, but the fact that more and more organizations are approaching the issue of trafficking and exploitation in times of crisis is actually bringing forth the idea that this is not just a supposition, this is not just something that we think exists, this is something that definitely exists, that needs to be urgently addressed, that needs an answer. I think that this is sinking in with the donor community as well, and I have seen already some responses also in a number of crises of trying to really bring together, to speak to each other, the humanitarian community and the developmental community. The clear gap has been seen. At least it is starting to be seen. Another challenge that indeed needs to be mentioned are funding. When funding are not there, then nobody can do anything at all. And so it is important to indeed have the buy-in of the local community. And the issue which Jennifer was also addressing before is really the fact that indeed sometimes mandates are a bit, well, you know, they tend to actually tell agencies to focus on some needs without actually considering others. It is true that this is sometimes the case still in the field, but I was listening recently to the UN Special Rapporteur on Trafficking in Persons, especially women and children, Madame Maria Grazia Gianmarinaro, who was actually mentioning that indeed in crisis and in general when there is a need, the first thing to ask is not what kind of crime this is there is a need, we need to respond. We need to be able to use the number of very valuable tools that we have to provide a comprehensive joint response. And this is also, we are currently working on developing an internal IOM strategy to specifically responding to trafficking and exploitation in times of crisis. And the basis of the strategy is that, of course, a response cannot happen in isolation. We cannot respond in a silos. It doesn't make any sense in ordinary times, and it would make even much less sense in a crisis. What we have done in the past was to, and especially, well, in the Philippines indeed, but even more so in Nepal, was to try and send a person to address the issue from the very beginning, work with the tools that we have. For example, we work very much with a tool that is called the Displacement Tracking Matrix, which is a tool that we use largely and very largely really in emergencies to have a very clear understanding of where the needs are among the affected population. This has recently been used also to include trafficking related and vulnerability related questions. The information that we gather from this tool are immediately shared within the pertinent clusters, first amongst which, for example, the protection cluster, and the information shared there helps all the members of the clusters to provide an answer. And this is what has been done in Nepal. And in Nepal, we brought in the protection cluster, also the local actors, starting from the local government and also some local organizations that were working on the issue, for them to be aware of what the tool's findings have been, to be able to work together at providing a response in collaboration with the agencies of the humanitarian community, as well as of agencies that existed before the crisis and are not necessarily part of the humanitarian community. In order to, when you talk about the program cycle, this is There would be a lot to say, and but just to say maybe the most important things. I think that indeed the fact that during crisis evidence of trafficking does not come out as immediately as the fact that people are without shelters, people need NFIs, etc., might do, should not refrain us from responding, and should not refrain donors from responding to requests for support. Now, if the donors respond immediately, then it means that funds are given immediately, and that a response to even prevent trafficking can happen from the very beginning. This can help, for example, to address issues that would have not been addressed in the past when this issue was not as clear as it is becoming now. And, for example, do as we did in Nepal, where we were able to put together a project of basically responding to protection and counter trafficking and trafficking vulnerability to trafficking, that was basically offering possibilities of accessing short-term and medium-term livelihoods to very vulnerable populations. This is just in a nutshell.
Great. I think this was an extremely rich discussion. So first I want to thank all of our panelists for speaking today and really elaborating on their actual experience in the field, in practice, but also sharing with us the challenges that they see and also possible solutions to help with looking at contribution and overcoming some of those barriers. I want to open it up now to others who are online to type in your questions or comments. And I know while they're doing that, I actually wanted to turn back to Patrick. So while we wait for some of the questions to come in, I'm wondering, Patrick, if you could speak to another question that I think is quite relevant given what we've talked about, especially how we start to engage multiple actors across the humanitarian development divide, etc. And I know a question that I'm sure many people are thinking, especially in a time of crisis, is if having to do that with multiple actors, how do we do that without slowing down the overall pace of the response? And so I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit of that and maybe perhaps give some examples of what you experienced within the Philippines, but how that might also look like in other crises that you've also engaged with.
Okay, Jenny, can you hear me?
We can, yes.
I just need to double check again. Okay, perfectly well. So I think I cannot really emphasize more the importance of engaging with the different stakeholders, both different actors, both internally and externally. They do play a crucial role, and especially understanding that addressing trafficking in person requires a very collaborative approach. So my take is the soonest we can start engaging with them, the better for us. So this is really right from the time of crisis. It's about putting your out and determining who is doing what where, and then how do you engage them in the process of conducting your analysis and pointing out what's their role in the whole process and what is your role as well. And then just engaging with them in the design process. So literally looking through the entire program cycle, it's quite important to have them on board as soon as you can and constantly engaging with them back and forth. And then looking at how it's going, getting back to them is very, very, very important. That's both internally but also externally. And like I said initially, understanding that they do have different roles. And it's quite important from experience that you spell out whose responsibility is going to be what right from initially, and understanding what's the strength and how you can complement that. And when that is well articulated, and it's actually with each stakeholder and with each partner understanding what their role is, in a very black and white way, which is sometimes a bit difficult. But if you've established that, then even the pace of work does not get slowed down. Normally what happens is, what I've seen is the pace of work gets slowed down or bogged down if there isn't a very clear and well-defined role that each and every one of us has to play. How do we all, what's our contribution to the broader response or strategy? So it's quite important to really articulate that, and acknowledging the fact that I think also acknowledging the fact that different stakeholders have different pace of work, and trying to adjust your approach to accommodate such slow response is something such stakeholders response speed is also quite important. So that's what that's what I would think.
Great, thank you so much, Patrick. I'm wondering, Michela, do you have any comments about that as well? Just to give you a chance as well to speak to the issue of the overall pace of a response, given all the different actors that we need to engage.
Yes, thank you. I fully agree actually with Patrick that the sooner the better and the more the better. In fact, what I was thinking while you were posing the question was that when we started involving, as soon as we were there, sharing information with the protection cluster, the 2 AURs, and then going to the local government and involving local actors and international organizations that had been there before the crisis, actually we had the opposite. We had a speeding up of the response. There were responses and suggestions of responses from all the new actors involved, and this helped us to indeed cover multiple areas, multiple possible areas of concern with multiple action at the same time. So at least in Nepal, this worked out very positively.
Great. So as we still wait for a couple more questions, I have another one here, and either one of you could speak to this. I have to apologize as well. Jenny McAvoy had to step out, so she's unfortunately unable to respond to any of the questions at the moment, but I still open the floor to both Patrick and Michela. But I'm wondering if either of you could talk then about the issue of decision making. So it's obviously critical to make decisions, and you're going to have multiple actors wanting to make decisions. So how do you do that? I mean, do you have ways to ensure who's making those types of decisions? Do you need always to have a collective decision-making process or approval by all actors in order to be able to move forward on different pieces of the work to contribute to solving the problem? So wondering if either of you have thoughts on like the decision-making process throughout this.
Well, I mean, I can speak briefly to the kind of bilateral agreements or engagements that we had, for example, with IOM, with IACAT, and TESDA that was providing technical support. We had, initial engagement really involved around negotiating on what each one is going to contribute and how that contribution is going to look like. And we reduced that to a level of actually coming up with a memorandum of understanding where we put it on pen and paper, and it kind of articulated in a very fine detail what contribution the other party would make. Take, for instance, if it was developing of outreach and awareness materials, that included, what it will entail, and also end-user agreement, acknowledging of the source of such information, and also coping. So you know, bilaterally we did have understandings, memorandum of understandings that was developed, which governed the partnership that we had. But for partners such as the local government, it was important to really understand that this was their mandate, and whatever we were doing was purely complementary. And once that was defined, then I think that was just a general understanding and agreement that we did. So oftentimes we would consult with them through meetings and let them take leadership and ownership of certain activities, rightly so because of their mandate.
Great, thank you so much, Patrick. Michela, did you have any thoughts on that one?
Thank you very much. I can only build on what was very rightfully said by Patrick. Indeed, we worked very well with World Vision and a number of other agencies in the Philippines. In fact, the Philippines was our the first example that we included in the research, that included not only just an analysis of the crisis but also a response. And indeed, in the Philippines, it was crucial that the major local agencies responding to trafficking was included in the protection cluster from the beginning, and then they basically ended up leading the response. Indeed, as Patrick was pointing out, the international community is there to support what already exists if it works. Then, of course, you know, if we are in a system that is completely dysfunctional, disrupted, depending on the kind of crisis, then, you know, of course, our action and the amount of it will variate. But otherwise, we are there to support the local capacity and to build upon it. So I would say that indeed it is important to involve all the local relevant actors to ensure that there is a buy-in and that there is support where support can come from, and for the local actors to also have a voice. Indeed, sometimes an MOU is needed. This is what we have seen in Nepal. Sometimes, though, there is no time for an MOU, and you know, as long as you know the main partners agree, then you can go ahead. But in a cluster-activated response, I would say that it is always very, very crucial to have the cluster head on board. So, you know, anything that is supposed to take place in the country, that it is discussed with the cluster head, that should also be discussed with the local government, that should actually be part of the cluster, leading the cluster actually be part of it, and so to take the decision after that.
Thank you both. That's very insightful examples that you both have given. I think we're going to go ahead and take one more question. And it's just a little past 11. And I know we had this webinar going to 11:30, but given we lost one speaker, I think we can cut it short a little bit. But this one, and I think, Michela, you've touched on this a little bit with IOM and in what you all have been doing internally. So it would be good also to hear from Patrick here in terms of looking at World Vision, but wondering about what type of organizational policies are needed then to create an environment and internal processes that support an integrated approach and the contributions needed in terms to enable to engage other actors and maximize their contribution towards achieving protection outcomes. So I'm wondering if either of you could talk a little bit more of the internal processes and policies that either you have created in order to create this type of an environment and support multi-sectoral approaches, or what you see as still needed. Patrick, are you speaking? I think we hear you slightly, but you might not be speaking in your microphone. Now you might be muted.
Sorry, it's just I have background noise here.
We have you now. Sorry, go ahead. No.
No. What I was just thinking through the question, and my thought is, I think it's quite important not just having the policy, but very well articulated document, which could be a policy in itself that streamlines and explains what integrated programming looks like, and spelling out what are the necessities, and if possible, a checklist as well. And that binds all agencies, rather all sectors within. For World Vision, certainly, we do have a policy that spells out our protection mainstreaming approach as well as our protection strategy. Although there is, it alludes to protection integration, but it's something that is still work in progress. But I really think having such policy in place is very, very, very important. And it could border, it would go hand in hand with integrated strategies for the different sectors, or for standalone projects. What would that really look like? Jessica?
Yeah, great. Michela, did you want to add anything?
No, I think that I've said my part on IUM before.
Yeah, definitely.
So yes, on this one, I think that yeah.
Great. And it's a shame that we weren't able to have Anne-Sophie from ECHO join us today, as she was going to elaborate a little bit further on ECHO's new, well, it's draft guidance on what integrated protection programming looks like and how ECHO is looking at this. So unfortunately, we don't have her to share that, but we can send around the link to everyone on this webinar so that you can review that and see what they're doing, at least within ECHO. So no, I think that's really important. So at this time, I really wanted to thank both or all of our participants today and speakers to be able to contribute their thinking, their knowledge, their practice in terms of helping us better understand what we mean by contribution of multiple actors and how we can better achieve protection outcomes. Before we totally wrap up, I do want to just allow both Patrick and Michela to give any last words or comments if they would like. And otherwise, also just to turn your attention to our website for results-based protection and how you can find out additional information. So, Michela, do you have any last comments or questions you'd like to leave us with?
Thank you very much. Actually, I just remembered that I didn't address the question on Jennifer on monitoring. Just very quickly to say that I think that monitoring, especially when we're talking about cases of trafficking and exploitation, is very hard also in ordinary times. And so it becomes extremely hard in situations of conflict. But the fact, and also, as I was saying before, the fact of not having evidence is sometimes an obstacle. But it is true that there are a certain number of tools that the humanitarian community is using, and IOM within it, that have actually proved very, very useful to monitor the response from the affected population and to actually find out about any new vulnerability. Yeah, I mean, I could go into the details of the tools, but maybe not at this time, just to know that, yes, there are some very interesting tools that the humanitarian community has developed and that could greatly help in terms of monitoring and following up with the local crisis-affected population. Otherwise, no, just a very quick note to thank you for having allowed me to participate in this very, very interesting exchange. And yes, to thank Patrick, yourself, and all the participants.
Great. Thank you so much, Michela. And we'll certainly ensure that our participants from the panel or from the webinar have the information, the report from IOM, as long as any other connections and links that you have perhaps on the monitoring tools, etc. So that would be excellent. And thanks again for your participation. Patrick, do you have any final thoughts or questions? Hey.
Well, firstly, you know, my profound gratitude for having given me opportunity to be on the panel. I really appreciate that, and it was nice listening to my colleague from IOM and Jenny as well. I mean, for me, really, I cannot. My emphasis is on conducting really very robust, you know, context-specific analysis as very important, and also recognizing the fact that you know, trafficking in persons, like any other protection need, requires contribution from the different actors and a multidisciplinary approach. My experience has proved that this has been very effective in achieving the outcomes that we needed, but also has had the greatest impact on the communities that we serve. For me, I think those are very crucial aspects that need to be taken. And then, you know, really, and the older that goes, flexibility is very key. Being flexible enough to problem solving rather than coming up with a very kind of formula type approach would be crucial. So other than that, thank you very much, and it's been really nice speaking to everybody.
Great. Thank you so much, Patrick. Again, thank you everybody for participating today. As you can see on the slide, there's our website, and a recording of this session will be available on our website shortly, so definitely forward it on to your colleagues to listen. And thank you very much.